Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 261. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by Tim Brownstone. Tim is the CEO at Kymira. Tim, how are we doing?
Doing very well, mate. Thank you. And yourself?
Yes, I'm very good. Thank you, Tim. Tim, if people haven't heard of yourself and Kymira, will you give a little bit of background, firstly on yourself, but also the company as well?
Absolutely. So I guess starting with myself, I'm a biochemist by academic background, ended up specializing in a field called photobiological wound healing, i.e. I was using different frequencies of light and seeing how that stimulated cell growth. And then I ended up specializing in, infrared as my sort of specific form of the EM spectrum. And then I don't know whether to say for my sins or, for whatever reasons compounded, final year of university, I decided that rather than going down the PhD route, I was impatient to see the technology out there and helping folks. So I had a background as an athlete in a number of different sports. So I sprinted to a low international level as a junior, competed as a lightweight rower, and then also in equestrian sport. So I knew all along through 5 years worth of research that there were applications in performance sport, but I kind of thought someone else would get there and, would be applying it. So, I just stuck to the lab side of things. And, the story of Kymira really came about to bring the technology I've been working on and get it into the hands of people it was going to start helping. And, almost a decade later, here we are.
Brilliant. So what does your role look like now then, Tim?
So day to day, I tend to be either client facing, so working with our sort of larger customers across the UK and US predominantly, time spent with investors, but then also, I find it hard to let the research go because it's a passion of mine. So while I may not be doing the research on a day-to-day basis, very much involved with different academic partners, such as University of Loughborough, where we've got a 3-year research program going. Some others, within clients of ours that are, buying and using Kymira and working out, kind of getting that kind of case study data back. And then our newer innovations, which we get time we can come on to at the end, but just sort of having a finger in there, because as I said, it keeps me passionate knowing that we're continuing to add value for our customers.
Brilliant. I know a lot of people say if you know a topic, you need to be able to describe it to 6-year-olds. And I am now the 6-year-old Tim. So in terms of the infrared technology, can you give a little bit of the science behind that to start with?
Yeah, so I guess if we start with kind of how do we get the infrared, and I can cover other sources for you within that, and then kind of what does that do for the user. So in terms of the how do we get it, you've got different forms. So if you're an early riser, you can get some infrared from sunlight in sort of the dawn hours as the sun is lower in the horizon, the way that the atmosphere filters out different light levels, you get good doses of infrared. That can be really good for things like melatonin production. Likewise, at the end of the day towards dusk. Then you've got sources like infrared saunas. They're probably the most common one that folks have come across in the past. And then you have other electronic sources. So you can have like light banks that will give you targeted emissions of infrared. And then you have sources like the ones that we've developed at Kymira, whereby we've actually built the technology into the materials that make our clothing itself so that it can be taken with you anywhere in the world. In terms of the benefits of that infrared, there are benefits from the amount of IR and then obviously the peak emission zones that you're going to be getting based on sort of biological responses. From a high level standpoint, and keeping within kind of the sporting realm, you've got the ability to accelerate kind of recovery processes post-exercise, but likewise to prime the individual for that exercise to reduce likelihood of injury occurrence. There are some direct performance enhancing benefits that we've come across in both anecdotal data coming from clients, but also some of the clinical data that's been published in peer review. And then newer areas we're looking into are actually compounding benefits, not where it's isolated just to the IR, but it's actually making something that's already beneficial even better. So, for example, we've had University of Texas ran a study on our sleep products and found a 15.9% improvement in sleep quality from athletes that were sleeping in Kymira. Now, sleep's already going to be good for you, but that's an example of making something that's good for you already even greater and come from the IR exposure. If you want me to go heavy into the science, I'm more than happy to, but trying to keep it to your 6-year-old level, that's kind of the high level of it.
Now, that is great for me, Tim, but I understand there's probably a few practitioners that have got a little bit more knowledge on the area. So I'd love for you to add another layer onto that if you could.
Absolutely. So speaking biochemically, the benefits that we know of, and I stress that we know of because I've been in the field now for 15, 16 years, and we're still, discovering new and interesting things that we, hadn't come across. And I love it when I get surprised because, it's something that's fascinating and interesting. So for that we know of, you can broadly group them into a couple of different pathways. So you've got pathway 1, which comes down to the increased production of nitric oxide. For any of the listeners, I doubt there are many, but if there are any listeners that don't know what nitric oxide is, it's a cell signaling chemical. It's heralded as a wonder chemical for the different benefits it can have on the body. In terms of the benefits we see applying it to both sporting and non-sporting benefits, that's vasodilation, so increasing the blood vessel volumes, allowing for the freer flow of blood to and from muscle cells, for example. Same effect on the lymphatic system, which allows us to accelerate lymphatic drainage. It's involved in the relaxation of skeletal muscle tissue. So it's not going to mean that if you've got a knot in your shoulder and you put on a Kymira hoodie like I'm wearing, or indeed if you go into an infrared sauna, all of a sudden that knot's going to disappear, but it can help to make the muscles more supple and therefore less likely to get that knot in the first place. And then one of the not newer areas per se, but the area that we have some ongoing research in as it pertains to nitric oxide levels. Nitric oxide is involved in an analgesic effect, which is the same pathway as if taking an opiate. Now, it's nowhere near as potent from a source like Kymira or from any other infrared source, but it's effective for long-term kind of chronic pain reduction. So we've seen reduction of muscle soreness of up to 25% coming from longitudinal data sets from our customers. And, that's from applying it across kind of round the clock. And then in isolated instances, we see that fall to about 15%, but it's still quite a significant reduction, whether that's in delayed onset muscle soreness or DOMS, or indeed whether that's into kind of chronic management, so tendinopathy, for example. So that's kind of your first grouping. Then the second one comes into the mitochondria. So again, just giving the 6-year-old description, mitochondria being the cell's power plants. I'm sure most of your audience, again, if not all of them, already know well and truly what mitochondria is, and probably more than I do. But we see the IR having multiple effects within the mitochondria. So one big one is the activation of cytochrome C oxidase. So that's the last of the second to last of the big gateway proteins that are involved in ATP production. So by basically opening the gates on cytochrome C oxidase, we see ADP phosphorylation being accelerated, more chemical units of energy going to the cells. Interestingly, sort of new clinical data is showing that longitudinal applications yield consistent increase in mitochondrial biogenesis. So that's the activity in the formation of new mitochondria. So from an athletic standpoint, it is quite clear in terms of how that can benefit one's fitness in performance, whether that's in an anaerobic or an aerobic capacity, but also very interesting for healthy aging, because one of the big issues with aging is as our mitochondrial level drops, we are therefore more fatigued more easily, etc. So we're investigating, well, actually, how could this be applied to benefit in aging populations, not just on a sporting sense. And then the final bit, which falls back into kind of my academic background, is while the mitochondrial plays into the cellular process, there are a number of other kind of compounding benefits that yield accelerated rates of cellular replication, healing, and we see damage to tissue healing at between 140 to 210% accelerated rate, dependent on tissue type, with the frequency of IR that we work within. So that's to stress that's not clinical data coming from Kymira gear, but it's clinical data from the sort of the subject experts in the field over the last 15 years or so, with the same frequencies of light that Kymira's products emit, or that you can achieve from other sources prior. And I'll pause there because I put a lot of information your way, and give you a chance if you want to ask any questions or anything on that.
No, that's a brilliant breakdown. I just wanted to ask, in terms of the other recovery protocols that, firstly, that are out there, but also that are really popular, especially within football, how would you say that compares to those?
So I think big thing is to stress that we don't preach that it's Kymira or. There are plenty of modalities where it can be Kymira and. So if you've got someone using a compression boot, for example, stick a pair of our tights on underneath, and the Kymira leggings are going to make the compression boot that much more effective, because you're going to be getting that vasodilation to allow the blood movement more freely. The biggest thing that I'd say we're able to give versus the majority of other recovery technologies or modalities is that we can be used, or Kymira's products at least, can be used anywhere, anytime, and there isn't a limit on how long to use it. So unlike a cryo chamber where you're in there for as little time as you can be, for example, or even your compression boot, you're only using that in a fixed location because you can't move. Whereas the big thing for us, and the way that we develop technologies as a business, is getting out of the infrared, and just more generally, is we choose to build it into clothing because then you can walk the dog, you can go to the shops, you can go on a date, you can get on with your life, because it's not just about the hours that an athlete is at the training center, but it's the 18 to 20 hours that they're not. And if we can build in that benefit around the clock, like the outcome of that, especially when you're looking at athlete availability, it really ratchets up.
You just mentioned there about some of the protocols that can sort of be combined with Kymira. Is there anything else, especially some of the common ones that might be used at clubs?
Yeah, so to be honest, the only one that we speak to as, do these sequentially rather than together is when you're looking for a vasoconstrictive application, because we are triggering vasodilation. Now, we haven't gone and clinically tested that because the exposure to infrared is not going to inhibit, for example, the constriction you're going to get in a cryo treatment, because it doesn't override the body's natural processes per se. But it just makes logical sense to not have the two running in parallel. So that kind of thing we'd say use in sequence. So you can still argue that that's in combination, but it's a sequential run rather than both at the same time. Other than that, really anything. So if you're using some percussion therapy, fine, do it in IR as well. If you're having massage, fair enough. You may not have the site covered when you're actually receiving the massage, but straight on afterwards, for example, be wearing it on the legs while the upper body's being worked on. So there's, as I mentioned, there's only really the vasoconstricted ones that we just sort of say doesn't really make sense to do them in parallel. Everything else, there are enough different variants of our products now that we can give you the site specificity if that's what's needed, or total body coverage, if that's what's needed. And it also comes down to what's best for the athlete. If they've got chronic hamstring issues, you're probably going to want to try and have them covered in a pair of shorts or a pair of leggings as much as possible. If they're working, with just Achilles tendinopathy, then you can just have them in a pair of socks and be targeting the benefit that way instead.
That's one thing I was going to say about the individual within a team, because I'm sure you found it being in contact with especially footballers that, and especially more experienced players, is they seem to have a recovery, whether it's one modality or a few modalities that they lean to, and that's their recovery method. And across a squad, you can probably name 20 different approaches that each player's taking, whether that's through experience, just whether that's through just it's a bit of routine and it makes them feel good. So how do you factor that in? These individuals, they've all got different approaches, they've all got different maybe perspectives on things. How do you factor that in?
So through a couple of different steps, I guess one of the first things is that many of our clients are, one of the things they're trying to do is start standardizing some of the proactive tools that they're taking. So that's not to say that if an athlete really wants something, they're not going to get something that's individualized based on their preference, but it's that the team or organization is recognizing that actually having some of these standardized processes proactively can allow us just to get ahead of and mitigate against risk of injury, for example. So many of our customers are there. Likewise, many of our customers, the reason that they don't have that standardized things that work for everybody is because they're using tools that compliance isn't great for, whether that's because it's a pair of really tight graduated compression tights that are uncomfortable for long-term usage, or whether it's because there's some athletes like hot and warm, others like cold and cryo, and there's preference there. So for example, last season, I think the lowest compliance rate that we had a team feedback to us for was 83%. But what we were replacing the season before, there was a 34% compliance across that season. That was a MLS team in the US. So that proactive application is often one of the points that we introduce at. The second is that we love to educate, whether it's the practitioners that we're working with on the staffing side, the coaches, and wherever possible, the athletes too. Like, we just love to speak about the science and the technologies we've developed. So quite often we'll be invited by the team to either do some continued professional development sessions for the staff, and likewise, if they then want us to come in, we'll run something for the players. Now, maybe pitch different levels, and we'll allow the players to dictate a bit more kind of how heavily we go on science. But from our standpoint, knowledge is power. And if the teams, the athletes understand, like, why am I using that? Generally speaking, there's the uptake is that much easier. And then the final thing that we look to do is, especially if we're introducing like this core, which is typically the core package, if you will, is a recovery pack that's generally centered for most sports on the lower torso coverage. So things like our recovery leggings and our socks, for example. When we're starting out with a new team, we sort of say for the first 2 weeks to the S&Cs and the med staff, for example, just remind players, put their recovery tights on for the first 2 weeks, because that's enough time for it to then be player-led, because they don't ache as much all of a sudden. Their legs aren't feeling as dead when they come to the next session. And usually within that 2-week block, if we've started out with a recovery modality, for example, that's enough time also for kind of player experimentation. So you'll start seeing players wearing them to the weight room, for example, because it doesn't take long to say, okay, well, my legs feel better when I'm recovering in these. I wonder if they feel even better if I train in them as well. And then thereafter, we then see kind of the extended applications where that individualization comes in. Player X, really wants some shorts because they want to wear them in game. Player Y, really wants to try out the pajamas or the bed sheets. We tend to kind of get that exploration then coming from the player driven rather than because the team's mandating it.
Yeah, I love that. I think I just want to pick up on that adherence, because I think you've mentioned it there through the education and I suppose the speed of getting players to buy into using things consistently initially, that's obviously where you're getting that adherence and that raising adherence. But is there anything else, especially for coaches listening, if they're like, right, we've got this recovery method we want to use, but players just aren't sticking to it, our adherence is right down, like you said, 30%, 20%, whatever it is. Is there anything else you'd advise coaches on in terms of trying to increase that?
I mean, the culture of that knowledge is power, the understanding, like I'd say that's really is core. But beyond that, you need to have effective modalities. And so if you're looking for something new to apply within a given squad, then if it's got your buy-in and you're using it yourself, you can speak personally to the benefit. That's one of the most powerful things, coming back to both that culture and the efficacy, because you can speak from your personal experience. It's not about, oh yeah, the sales rep told us this, but it's actually, I don't know, we've got one guy that we work with who's an ex professional baseball player and American footballer. And when we first started working with him, he got himself some Kymira to test out and things. And he said within, I think it was 2 nights of using it, he gave me a call and he said, for the 20 years, I've had to start my day with kind of a shoulder and neck massage because I'm immobile when I wake up. And for the first time in 20 years, I haven't had to do that. And that's huge for me. Likewise, we've been doing athlete education sessions, and the athletes invariably say, "Hey, coach, what do you think?" And one session I was doing it, and coach plus 3 of the assistant coaches pulled up their tracksuits and they had Kymira leggings on underneath. And so that kind of messaging of, it's not just for you guys, we're practicing what we're advising here. That's really big. And again, within coaching staff, you're going to have preferences. So just telling that story from the personal side is really big. Plus the fact that often the focus is on the athlete because the athlete is the performing part on the actual competition day, but the staff are traveling just as much as the athletes are. The staff are on their feet as much, if not more, than the athletes are. Maybe not getting as much wattage from their exertion, but they're still on their feet on the pitch, on the side of the pitch, in the gym. And so from our perspective, we are technology and we don't discriminate in terms of who could benefit from infrared, because as far as we see it, everybody within the organization can.
Yeah, 100%. I think with anything like this as well, obviously the education is crucial, isn't it? But it's also ease of use and accessibility for players, isn't it? That, like you say, if you're asking players to change a routine massively, then it's going to be a much harder sell. For anything that you're trying to introduce that's fairly minimal or seems minimal for them, I think that's the key, isn't it, in getting this change in, I suppose, changing habit and routine, isn't it? That's a big part of it.
Well, that's it. And one of the unofficial kind of internal ethos that we have is literally make it as simple as getting dressed, or in the bed, for instance, just go to bed. But likewise, building in what we were talking about in the previous answer, and not to get too marketing here, but we're currently running a campaign called "Worn to Be Believed," and really that is because folks often will look at a piece of clothing and because it doesn't look any different to the naked eye, it's quite easy to dismiss, and that's by design. We don't want it to be in your face. We just want the technology to be there, taking care of the athlete in the background. And as you say, minimizing that disruption, it doesn't necessarily improve outcomes if the tech didn't work, but it does at least reduce the barrier to starting to use it. And then the one thing that you'll never see us doing, at least, is pushing for kind of match day usage, because that has to be player led. A lot of Kymira's team are either current sort of amateur or semi-pro athletes, or we were athletes at one point. Sadly, I'm in the we were category. But, we understand the mindset of, if we were to ask for a forced change for something that you might have been doing a particular way for 20 odd years, psychologically, that could go against all the benefits that we're trying to, provide physiologically. But we also know that in our instance, we can say that in the safety that many of those athletes will ask, can I get some match day kit here, without logos, etc., because the technology does what we say it does on the tin.
But the big part of that is getting that belief and buy-in from the player, isn't it? I suppose to get to that point,
Absolutely.
like you say, to change that routine around a match day is going to be, well, a harder sell, I imagine, than every other day. But if they get to that point, they're obviously feeling some real benefit.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's brilliant. In terms of education then for the coaches, because like you've mentioned there, that the coaches are vital, aren't they, for anything you're trying to implement within a program. If you've got any resistance from the coaching side, or I suppose lack of full buy-in and belief from the coaching side, that's going to rub onto players. So how do you go about that in terms of upskilling the coaches, and maybe what are some of the key areas you felt like you needed to focus on with coach education development?
Yeah. So I'd say the coaches are probably one of the areas where we have the biggest variance in time, kind of the either time we can get with them, because the time is scarce, and also the information that they want, in the sense that I've had some coaches who are sports scientists academically, and they're really information hungry. We've had others that have maybe come into coaching through the sort of being players themselves and aren't as, it's not that they're less scientifically literate, but they're just, that's not their main focus. They might be more interested in usability, for example. And we go about it in a couple of different ways. Sometimes it's through training up the sort of strength and conditioning staff, the medical staff, whom then educate the coaching staff without us kind of having that direct session. Other times we'll run just coaching staff sessions where we will be led more by the applied benefit. So what does it actually mean to the athlete in terms of performance effects, recovery effects, and then we go into the science, based on the questions that we're getting. And other times it's on a more one-to-one basis. We might be introduced to, or we might reach out to a specific coach, and it will be on that kind of more one-to-one level, and then he or she will take us to the wider team, because they then want that to be transmitted around the organization.
Yeah, it's definitely needed, isn't it? You've got to create that buy-in from those practitioners to spread that word, haven't you? So I think it's really important. I think we spoke about it a few times in terms of education for coaches in a number of different topics, and this seems like it's the same in terms of getting to the right people.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the key from our standpoint, and many others in the industry that are, in my personal opinion, kind of doing it the right way, for those that are listening rather than seeing, air quoted there. But getting that buy-in because you have understanding it's a really powerful thing, because then it gives an informed choice into why you would do this. And yes, okay, using our particular products, a very low barrier to entry, but it still should be an informed choice for it to become athlete driven.
When you're interacting with players, or maybe this is through the coaches as well, on getting the feedback and maybe even tying in some of the research that you're doing as well, how does that look? Is that through wellbeing questionnaires? Like, what actual feedback are you getting from the players and the athletes?
Yeah, so typically speaking, if we're doing it with the players themselves, it's often more subjective. So they're feeding back, and we'll either get quotes that are sent to us via the practitioners, or we also get players that will post about us on Instagram, or they'll reach out to us directly to say thanks, because we've made a really big impact for them, helped them to come back from injury in less time, or we've helped them stop getting injured when they previously would be. So in those instances, we can collect those quotes, and we started, they get shared internally and in discussions. We'd never, take someone's quote and then share it online without their permission, which sometimes we do, say, we really love that, would you be happy for us to reshare it? And then in a more formal structure, not all, but many of the teams that we work with, because, they want to monitor what's the effect of this, will then share that information with us. Generally speaking, the kind of statistics, etc., that we're able to then share are within the recovery sphere, because the performance, side, if we're getting shared, that is kept quite tight under lock and key because it's the secret source. And how it's collected wherever possible from our end, it's A, objective, and B, it's using existing methods. So we're not introducing a barrier again because we're asking for a different kind of monitoring solution. So to give you like a real recent hot off the press, we've had within our network, obviously we work with a lot of sports scientists, and over the last few months, some of them have been doing some just sort of anecdotal data collection, looking into comparing their recovery scores with their given monitor. So I think most of them were either Whoop bands or Oura rings, and we saw I think it was most were a 10 to 12% increase in the recovery score when recovering in Kymira versus normal. So that's one area where we'd say this is really anecdotal. It's quite low participant numbers, so it's indicative. Other areas, we've got teams such as an international rugby team that is in the semi-finals of the World Cup. They cannot specify who. We have a 5-year data set from them from the recovery side. So in that instance, that's a really powerful data set because it's a really long period of data collection. We don't have all the day-by-day numbers, but we have the output metrics that come from them. And then we have some customers that I mentioned the sleep study earlier, where they have specifically gone and conducted applied research. So it's not necessarily clinical and controlling every variable like you would in a lab, but it's applied with real life athletes. And then they've, it's taken a proper experimental design and scientific method to that data collection, and they fed that back to us. Then we have all the clinical data, which is fully conducted clinically with controlled variables, and ideally has gone through peer review.
And I know you've mentioned some already, but is there any other research that you think would be good for the listeners to hear in terms of some of the case studies and the research that you've done recently?
So in terms of case studies, the international rugby team, they saw over this 5-year period a average 25% reduction in perceived pain scores from a holistic application across the day, a 33% improvement in mobility scores, and then we helped them to achieve a 80% reduction in musculoskeletal injuries. So that's one set that we're sort of really proud of, because reducing injured athletes is very dear to all of our hearts. There's no point giving an athlete an extra gear, which is going to break them quicker. The sleep study I mentioned was a 15.9% improvement in sleep quality, which was collected using fatigue science sleep bands, so that was an average of 5 different data points that measures. And then they also combined that with daily wellness surveys, where they saw I think it was a 14.9% reduction in perceived muscle soreness. And go figure, because the athletes were sleeping better and they didn't ache as much, the morale score, I think, improved by something like 13.6%. So those are some examples on the anecdotal side of things. On the recovery end, going more into kind of the applied side, we have a coach up in Scotland who's a cycling and triathlon coach, and he's been putting athletes, I think he's put about 25 athletes through this protocol, doing an interval session, comparing with Kymira versus their standard kit. Yeah, it's anecdotal because he wasn't controlling for sleep or nutrition or anything, but the average reduction, when in the resting phase between the intervals, the athletes, when wearing Kymira, were had an average of 10 beats per minute lower heart rate than they did in their standard cycling gear, indicative of sort of cardiovascular recovery being accelerated that much. And then as a performance-wise, I think that's probably the only one that I can speak about, not so necessarily that we've seen. From the collating performance data that comes into us, that we're then told, this is only for you guys to see, in terms of giving you and your listeners an indication of what does it do on a performance end. For an endurance athlete, it might have, this is like first time usage, so no physiological adaptations occurred, might have a slight elevation in speed or wattage, whatever your kind of Y axis metric is, but the big difference comes into extending the peak performance zone of the athlete and reducing the late session fatigue. For your kind of power-based athlete, we think that the benefits come from actually maximizing the rest phase, as I spoke to with the cycling data, between bouts of exercise. So for a power endurance athlete like a footballer, between sprints up and down the pitch, for example, that rest phase is going to be improved, which means that the in-session fatigue is reduced, and therefore kind of the endurance across a game, across a training session, is increased. And then we have to date, I say we and our technology partners, because I worked with a Californian company called Polygenics to develop the materials that we use in our products. There are 10 peer-reviewed studies that have been published to date across a variety of different areas. Typically it's into sort of the smaller levels, so the increase in circulation, the tissue oxygen level increases, that kind of thing, as opposed to the applied outcome. And sorry, I waffled a bit there, I went on a bit.
No, that's good. That's good. You've just mentioned there about some of the future areas of research that will be released, but is there anything else that maybe you've not tapped into yet that you're definitely keen to have a look at?
So one of the areas that I'm most interested in, which is some of the ongoing research that's being done with University of Loughborough. So the core foundation of that research block is looking into the chronic adaptive processes and how they change when exposed to infrared light. Specifically within that, the bit that's kind of got me most interested is, we know about the analgesic benefits of when you're wearing or you're exposed to infrared, whether it's in a sauna or you're wearing our kit. And I mentioned at the top of the call that those are related to the production of nitric oxide. But nitric oxide's got a really short half-life, so once you take the stimuli away, whether that's taking our products off or you've stepped out of the sauna, whatever your IR source is, there is a post-exposure benefit. But once you've kind of gone through your washout period, which is going to be, a couple of hours, 2-3 hours at most, you would expect that the muscle soreness would return to the expected baseline levels for that individual athlete. And what we see is that they don't, they stay reduced. So one of the things that we're exploring as part of that research block is testing the hypothesis of whether the actual cause of that soreness, i.e. the exercise-induced muscle damage, is being reduced by wearing it in a performance setting. Now, at this point, I don't know if it will or won't be. I'm pretty sure the study's just got ethics approved, so we'll be starting those trials imminently. But that would be really cool, because it's kind of going counter to kind of human phys 101, whereby you're causing exercise-induced muscle damage, and then through the way that the muscle then heals and adapts from that, you get bigger, leaner, stronger, whatever it is that you're training for. If we see the acceleration of that chronic adaptation, which we do, but we're achieving it in a slightly different way, is that more efficient? Is that more effective? So that's something that I'm personally really interested in, because that would be really cool from an academic standpoint, and then that would be another 5-10 years worth of research for us to then go and explore even further.
Brilliant. Tim, I thought I'd just wrap us up with getting your perspective on, obviously the obvious answer to this is the Kymira and investing in Kymira, but if you could leave our listeners with one little bit of advice in terms of utilizing infrared technology, if they couldn't get Kymira, if they could, then great. But if they couldn't, is there anything that you'd say in terms of a recommendation?
So, I mean, I think the first step, irrespective of us, is do it. You know, there is enough clinical data, anecdotal data, you know, out there to suggest, you know, it's really beneficial. If you're not going to look into us specifically and you're looking at other forms of infrared, the biggest things that I would be encouraging for selection of applying infrared in a given setting is going to be your ease of use, your convenience factor, and then the ability to be using it over a long extended duration of time. Because again, as we discussed a bit earlier, it's not just about helping that athlete when they're in facility. Giving the benefit for the athlete across that extended duration is going to make so much of a compounding benefit rather than, let's say, the isolated while you've got them in facility. So applications that they can use at home, applications they can use when they're on the road, you know, those are the things. And that's very much where that kind of transportability convenience factor, you know, you guys work with Hytro, and again, that's another sort of modality where you have that ease of use, that convenience. You take it anywhere with the team or the athlete goes. Like, for me, that's a really big selection criteria because that means the benefit is extended.
Brilliant. Tim, if people want to check out the work that Kymira are doing, or if you've got any links or anything you'd like to share, where would you direct people to go?
So the main website is kymira.com. That's KYMIRA.com. And for those that are interested, right now we have sort of an offer whereby we'll do a 2-athlete kind of free of charge trial for you to get your hands on some Kymira, or 2 coaches indeed, and actually put the product to the test and see how it works within your given setting. So get in touch with us, and we'd love to talk with anybody that's interested.
Brilliant. How do they claim that offer, Tim?
So they can reach out to us through the website, you know, in the contact areas, and they'll get through to the appropriate people within the team to then go and sort them out.
Perfect. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, and yeah, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. Thank you.